Ever feel like you're doing this teaching thing alone? You don't have to be. Shared teaching is all about sharing the workload through the power of collaboration and teamwork. Together, we'll walk through all the difficult parts of teaching and learn how to streamline our processes, fine-tune our time management, and develop a more manageable workload. If that sounds like a dream come true to you, then welcome to the Shared Teaching Podcast. Let's share in the teaching to make those dreams a reality. Now here's today's Shared Teaching. Hello and welcome back to the Shared Teaching Podcast. I'm your host, Susan, and today we have another exciting guest. We have returning guest, Dr. Deonna Smith, who is a former teacher and school leader and an educational justice advocate. With over a decade of experience, Deonna has worked with students and teachers in grades K through 12 and even in the higher education setting. As a student, teacher, DEI practitioner, and administrator, Deonna saw firsthand how inequitable our schools could be, but she also saw the potential for schools to be spaces of liberation and joy. Deonna's passion for connecting theory with practice led her to pursue and complete her doctoral degree in education and social justice. In her work, she strives to make theories and pedagogies accessible and applicable to teachers and learners. After wearing many hats inside the school building, Deonna has now transitioned into her advocacy work, where she is working with education stakeholders across the country to fight for joyful, inclusive, and equitable spaces for students. Deonna has published a book called Rooted in Joy, Creating a Classroom Community of Equity, Belonging, and Care, which you can find in Amazon. We'll have links in the show notes. I'm very happy to welcome back Deonna to our podcast. You have written a book that we talked about in the past called Rooted in Joy. So I'm so happy and honored that we have another chance to reconnect. So welcome and thanks for being here again.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be back here with this community. I had such a great conversation with you last time, so I knew I wanted to circle back. And yeah, excited to chat more, catch up after this year it's been since I've been on the podcast and, hopefully give some strategies for your listeners that could help them.
Of course. So last time we talked a lot about just bringing that joy back to the classroom. And then this time, I think we're going to talk about that again, but also kind of weave in some culturally responsive practices. Yeah. So let's just start there and unpack, what does it mean to be culturally responsive?
Perfect. Yeah, it's a great place to start. And I always say that culturally responsive teaching is just good teaching. And so it basically means that you as a teacher understand that you are bringing your own culture and your own frames of reference to the classroom, and your students are doing the same. And so culturally responsive teaching is really a way of understanding that our students' funds of knowledge and cultural experiences are valuable and have a place inside the classroom. And we can make sure that we are responding to the variety of the different needs of our different learners by understanding what it means to just kind of respond to those cultural frames of references while being aware of our own.
Right. And I feel like this is good timing, same as last time, because I think you were on in October before. Because coming up, we have a bunch of different holidays and celebrations. And I know just yesterday, I had this conversation with a coworker that she's like, I got to leave real quick. And she wanted to dive over to the student council meeting because she's like, they're going to be talking about dress up days. And she's like, I just know there's going to be a disaster coming. And sure enough, she's like, I stopped it just in time. So let's talk about some of these ways that we can kind of avoid the common pitfalls that we fall into when we're celebrating things like Hispanic Heritage Month or Black History Month and asking students to do dress up days.
Yeah. It's great with Halloween coming and everything. It's a great time to have this conversation. I think that, all of it starts with usually a good intention. And so that's something that I always like to help people understand in this work is that your intent is not always the same as your impact. So you might have really good intentions, but it might land differently with folks. And so I understand the intention behind, some of the dress up days that you'll see, I saw some teachers that were dressing up, they had I guess I would say a Mexican day, right? And so, and some of the teachers dressed up as like border crossers, and which was very, obviously very culturally insensitive. I've seen, students dress up as Indigenous folks, Native Americans, and adults as well. And so, I think when you're thinking about, celebrating and honoring different cultures, just to remember that there's a really fine line between appropriation and appreciation. And
Very
if you
true.
aren't sure about like where that's falling, and if you feel like you might, be leaning into appropriation, I would invite you to just, make another choice. There are so many different like things to do that, we're not low on ideas for how to honor other cultures. So especially wearing like ceremonial garb or really playing into stereotypes about a certain culture, those kinds of behaviors can be really harmful because you're either perpetuating a negative stereotype, or it could even be a positive stereotype, but stereotypes are problematic in general. Or, you might be accidentally insulting a different culture because you're using, their cultural regalia or memorabilia in a way that is not actually appropriate. And so just stay away from those things. I always say there's so many different ways. And I think that if you are really interested genuinely in learning about other cultures, that's amazing. And I encourage people to do that. So I hope that doesn't scare people for them to say like, oh, well, then I guess I just won't do anything, because that's not, the case. It's really just about, leaning into learning and remembering that, you want to still be representing yourself in a way, because your students are going to be emulating what you're doing as well. So thinking about that too.
I am wondering, so if I'm a newer teacher, or maybe I want to start learning to do better, what is a way that I can phrase it to have this conversation with my families if maybe my school isn't quite on board yet, but I want to kind of turn that around within my own classroom?
Yeah, so I love this question because I know that there's a lot of teachers who are working in districts that have a lot of misguided rules and regulations around anti-DEI or whatever. And so I think that that's definitely something that I want to help folks navigate. And I would say that firstly, you got to remember that the question of like, are people coming from different cultures? Do we all have different perspectives and points of view? Are we all representing, the diversity that is the United States? That's not really controversial, because that's just, a literal fact that you can observe and experience. And so I think just starting with bringing culture in is a great way, because that is not something that could be misconstrued as political, really, because you're just wanting to know more about your students and their backgrounds and celebrating those backgrounds. So I think that is a great way to start. I always, at the beginning of the year, send out a letter to my families, which tells them that I was trained in culture responsive teaching methods, and I plan on working with them to make sure that I'm supporting their student, and that I believe that like all of our students, that diversity of our classroom is a strength, not a weakness. And so I start off the year by saying something like that. And again, all of those things are not statements that should be kind of flagged as controversial. So that's a good place to start, just with celebration and welcoming in other cultures.
Okay, perfect. And while you were talking about that, I remember last time you were on, you talked about reading, is it Esperanza Rising? And you
Yeah.
invited a parent in, and she read it in Spanish. So, what are some ways, maybe small ways like that, that are coming up soon that we can kind of involve our community and our family members?
Yeah, that's awesome. That was a super fun thing that we did. I love bringing in guest speakers. I love, families talking about their experiences. You could also think about Phil's trip. For example, November is Indigenous Peoples Month. If you live in an area where there is a museum dedicated to the Indigenous folks that were in the area before colonization, if there's an event being put on, maybe by the local tribe or the First Nations that are around, look into those kinds of things. Those are great opportunities. As a student, my teacher actually took us to powwow one year, and it totally opened my eyes to like, wow, this whole other, world and environment. So there's plenty of different ways that you can think of field trips. But if you can't go anywhere, there's like online virtual field trips. The American Indian History Museum, that's based in New York, I believe, they have a lot of virtual things online that you could do for Indigenous Peoples Month. There are so many different ways And it can start, just really simple things that you could probably honestly find online resources. But I always like to encourage people to go into the communities if they can. And even if it's not an official school field trip, perhaps you could offer off extra credit. Just say like, hey, this Saturday, there is a, Dia de los Muertos festival, extra credit to students who go and like take a picture and you can bring it back to class and talk about it. So there's plenty of little things that you can do.
That's a really good point. And I always forget about the virtual field trips. I don't know why. They were so big during COVID. And then all of a sudden it's like, field trip? What?
Yeah. And it can be difficult on the budget. So I always recommend, I mean, it's like Black History Month, we have a few months for that, but the African American History Museum, Smithsonian in DC, that's another one that has amazing resources online for you to do kind of like a virtual interactive experience. So lots of cool things out there.
Awesome. Yeah. So I'll make sure to list those because I'm interested in some of those as well. Because, like there is so much available. And I think we always forget that a lot of these cultural events have speakers that are willing to come to the schools free of charge just to get their message across.
Yes.
We just have to ask.
And especially, you get the history nerds that just like live for this stuff. And
right.
They will totally, jump at the opportunity. So, I mean, that's one way to start. I would say the other thing to start with too, y'all, is always remembering to start with your own internal work. You might not have had anti-bias training. You might not have had the privilege of really unpacking your identity and reflecting on just what you are bringing to the classroom. And so as much as we focus on, making sure we have those materials for our students, you also are bringing a lot as whoever you are, your whole knapsack of experiences. And so unpacking that is a great place to start as well.
That's a really good point as well, because it's true. And then also, the more we know, the more we can share, which is the whole point of teaching.
Yes, exactly.
We were talking before we came on with the listeners, and we were saying that the culture across, I don't know how widespread you've been across America, promoting your book and doing a lot of really intensive work in the schools, but there's this vibe going on this year that is just kind of difficult, a little dismal. So let's kind of unpack that a little bit and see how we can spin that around and just enjoy our school year and be happy and thankful with our own little classroom. Because I talk a lot about how we can impact what we're doing within our room by shutting our door. We don't necessarily have to always go against the grain, but we don't have to be very vocal that we're going against it either.
Yes. Yeah, there it is. It's been a tough couple years in education. And I think that a lot of the bad news, the negative press, the continuous stream of kind of demoralizing laws and regulations around like what we're allowed to teach, that can be really, I think, demoralizing for folks. Like I have a lot of friends who are in Florida that are just feeling super frustrated and, just people around the country just, feeling, I would say, frustrated. And teaching is one of those careers where everybody has a lot to say about how it's done. But, people think that just being a student is enough to understand what it means to be a teacher. And that's not the case. And I always equate it to being a doctor. Like just because you've been sick does not mean that you should be making rules about how doctors do their jobs. And I think in education, we have that problem, right? People feel like, oh, I was a student, so I know. So sometimes, you just got to shut a lot of that out. Like you said, close your door and really kind of create a space with more positivity because a lot of that stuff can really wear you down. So I really recommend for folks to, one, I always say like a joyful classroom starts with the teacher. And so a lot of people have been struggling with whether it is seasonal depression or, anxiety or just kind of the long-term lingering impact of the pandemic. I think we came back from the pandemic, but I don't know that everybody really had the time to process the pandemic and process all of the things. And so I think a lot of us just personally have to start with reconnecting to that joy because it's going to be really hard for you to run a joyful classroom if you are feeling, kind of abysmal every single day. So in my work that I do, I have four components that we talk about. And the first one is that I am joyful, speaking about the teacher. And so it really starts with you pouring into yourself, not just self-care in the, commercial bubble bath type of thing, but true self-care, like really, making the changes that you need in your life for you to feel good. And then really, understanding that, like you said, you can do so much inside of your classroom. You might not be able to change, the district's standardized testing policy. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But there's a lot of things that you can do inside your classroom to make it feel good for you and your students. So I would say always starting there, starting with finding joy for yourself. And then also just understanding too that because our kids were kind of born and bred and grew up in that pandemic era, I think that they also have a harder time just with the connection and with the engagement in general. And so for some of us who maybe all the strategies that we were doing before, the way that we used to do things, that just might not work anymore. And so some of it too is relearning and rebuilding a set of skills to meet the unique demands of our students who really struggle with connection, who need to learn explicitly how to be social creatures, who need
Mm-hmm.
be engaged differently because their attention spans are dramatically reduced. So all of that kind of almost rethinking how we move about the classroom and the way that we do things, that piece has to happen as well.
Right. I totally agree because I'm just picturing like the way they even speak with one another. They've forgotten how to have just that impactful dialogue
Mhm.
and discussions that are on point. It's all these name callings and,
Yeah.
they just get off track so quickly. Do you have any tips for kind of starting there, I guess, for building them up to build each other up?
Mhm. Well, the first thing I would say is again, I believe in an explicit focus and explicit engagement of social emotional learning. And I think for at least for me, right? So in middle school, I had a lot of colleagues that were really stuck on should. Well, they should know how to do this, well, you should Or on the flip side, they're like, well, in high school, nobody's going to teach them about about, relationship building. So we need to get them ready for high school. And as much as I understand the draw to that kind of thinking and that mindset, it doesn't really serve our students because the reality is whether they should or should not know how to communicate with each other, whether they should or should not be able to pay attention, whether they should or should not know what respect looks like in a classroom, they don't. So it is on us to build in that explicit skill building, do through a lot of modeling, through connections to literacy. I did a lot of like, well, let's look at this character. Like, what does it mean to have this character? What type of person is this person we're reading about? What type of person are you? Who's a person that you admire? Talking about role models. All of those things are great ways to start to have a conversation with students just about the being a good human being. And, you know, it's unfortunate because teaching them how to be good humans is not on the scope and sequence, but sometimes we need to add it because you're not going to be able to get to the work unless you are able to engage them in that work. And so I think there's a fair amount of that needs to take place. And then also, I would say that understanding that our students need this investment in this time. And sometimes that means that you might have to pull away from what you would regularly be doing to address what's going on. But this is kind of, what I do a lot of is equipping teachers with those skills, but a lot of it starts with us. It starts with us being regulated because an escalated adult cannot de-escalate an escalated child, for example. So it's so important that, we ourselves are well and regulated and healthy and happy so that we can navigate those situations.
That's definitely a fair point for sure. So you mentioned there was a four-step process, and I think I interrupted
Yeah.
you after the second step. So let's go
Yeah.
back to that.
Okay, so yeah, so basically, joyful and inclusive schools is a four-part framework. And the first part is I am joyful. And that's that the adults in the building are getting what they need to be able to show up as their best self on a daily basis. Like, not whether that is, big picture things like self-care days written into their contracts, and then little things like just notes of appreciation instead of just negative feedback, right? So that's the first component is I am joyful. And then the next component is our community is a joyful place to be. And really what that means is that the school community understands that it's not just about reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's about having fun together. It's about laughing together. It's about the field day. It's about the field trip. It's about the dress up week. It's about, the school play, all of these pieces that a lot of those things have went away since the pandemic, but really bringing back the community feel and the connectedness and the belonging that our schools used to really do a lot of work around. And that is also a huge component of reducing chronic absenteeism, because I know a lot of communities are struggling with chronic absenteeism. And so when I work with a school and they're like, well, how do we get more kids to come to school? And I say, well, why would they come to school? I mean, they come to school, they come here, somebody's calling them a name. The teacher only has negative feedback for them. They're policed on what they wear all day. And then, they eat lunch. They have like an hour maybe of freedom. And then they go back to the drudgery and then they go home. And so now, because how much things have changed, a lot of kids are just not coming to school, and our families are just not really I think the investment in like attendance has shifted a lot for our families too. So our community is a joyful place to be really talks about belonging and inclusion and joy as a way to combat those feelings of isolation and the chronic absenteeism that so many schools are experiencing. And then my students are joyful, which means that's the culturally responsive piece, because you can't be joyful unless you're able to express your full and authentic self. And so that really focuses on creating spaces where students' identities are welcomed, celebrated, and uplifted, where students can be themselves, where students see themselves, where they feel, at home and they feel comfortable and they feel seen, loved, and heard. And so that's my students are joyful piece. And then the last component is I enjoy learning. Right? Because we're a school. Like at the end of the day, you got to learn. And so that's that focus on the instructional practices that motivates reluctant learners, that builds resourceful learners, and that moves our students from dependent to independent thinkers. And so that's that last component. And it's all about really instruction and how we can meet this moment. And regardless of whatever curriculum you have, even if it's super boring, what can you do to bring those kids in?
I like it. It makes a lot of sense too, because you're kind of starting from the top down. You're starting with yourself and then the community, and then slowly kind of narrowing it down to finally the student at the end. So I think that's important to note that in your model, the student is not at the top, because we need to work on ourselves and the community before we can get to that individual student need.
Yeah. And a huge piece of what I do, right, is focused on those proactive strategies, because a lot of times when schools reach out to me and they're like, okay, we're having huge behavior problems. We've got all these kids going to the office, or, we've got fighting, whatever. Usually what they're thinking that I'm going to do is give them a long list of reactive strategies. Like, okay, here's what you do when your student is not listening to you and you've redirected and taken away 75 class dojo points, right? But instead of doing that, I really focus on proactive strategies. And that is what kind of I feel is what brings the long-term change, because if we can create this really healthy, thriving classroom community, you're not even going to need to know how to respond to student behavior, because the behaviors are going to be dramatically reduced. Now, you're always going to have something, because we're talking about children, and they learn through doing, they learn through pushing boundaries, but there's the way to reduce the challenges is not just to find more, carrots and sticks. It's to really think about the community that you're building.
Right. So let's talk about ways to make our classrooms more joyful, because I know that's kind of the heart of your book, right?
Yeah.
And so how can we just get some of that back for ourselves?
Yeah. So I think one thing is, as silly as it might sound, you have to actually start by scheduling it. I would encourage everyone to look at your, planning. If you do plan by the week, no judgment if you don't, but if you do plan by the week, by the month, look at it and really ask yourself, like, okay, where am I seeing like moments of joy? Like, where am I seeing connection? Where am I seeing laughter? Where am I seeing community building in this schedule? And then if you don't see it, you need to kind of plan it in, because for some people, and a lot of times I feel like it's almost lower elementary teachers, the Miss Frizzles out there, they don't need to schedule it in. They're doing it. It comes, naturally off the cuff. But for a lot of us, that's not necessarily our wheelhouse. That's not the way that we are in the classroom for whatever reason. So if you're not a teacher that, finds yourself just like weaving in the joy supernaturally, I say schedule it in, put it on the planner. If you don't see a moment of joy every single day, even if it's just at the end of the day, we're going to play Heads Up, 7 Up, or Simon Says, I'm going to add something every single day or every single, week to build in that joy.
That's good. I never thought about it like that, but it's true. Like, look through your lesson plan and maybe just like make little notes on how can I add that quick little engagement piece or something.
Yep, absolutely.
And then ending the day with Heads Up, 7 Up. Like, how easy is that? Like kids are playing, other kids like, go get your backpack, come back. Like,
right.
Yeah. And then they go home happy because they had a good, nice ending.
That's the last thing that they remember is like, oh, that was fun, So then the next morning they're ready to go. Exactly.
Right. I like it. Do you have any other quick tips or things that we want to talk about today with our listeners?
Yeah, I would say, that it might feel like a lot, but just remember you can start like piece by piece. So I recommend people start, if you're a multiple subject teacher, start by subject. So maybe like if you're really good at math and that's your favorite subject to teach, start there. Start with what you're good at and start adding more fun, adding more projects, adding more examples, adding a few videos, whatever sprinkled into the math class. Or if you are a teacher that's a single subject, you can start by the day. So maybe, Thursday is your day where you're doing something more interactive. You're doing a basketball game, trash ball review. You're doing a Kahoot. You're doing a Jeopardy, whatever it is, right? So if you're kind of feeling like, oh, my class is super boring, I don't even know where to start, you can start by the subject or by the day or, even by the class period if you're a single subject teacher. So there's a lot of ways to get started and it can be very accessible. And then also just remember that, we are lifelong learners. And so if there's something that I'm talking about, or you're hearing about other things and you're kind of like, oh, I'm not super familiar with that. The beauty of education is, there's so many people, even on Instagram, on YouTube, there's lots of books about it. I wrote a book about it. Most of my friends have written books about it. Like there's so many resources out there. So if you're feeling stuck, just know that you don't have to stay there. There are people out there that want to help you, even if it's just getting an instructional coach. Like I hate to see teachers that are like wanting to leave the profession because they just feel like kind of disengaged and stuck. No one ever has to feel like that. There's so many resources to help you get unstuck.
Right, for sure. And speaking of resources to help us along, I know you have a YouTube channel. So you want to give it a shout out here?
Yes. No, I would love for you to join me over at That's Just Good Teaching over on YouTube. And I have lots of free videos there that focus on different subjects. I also provide plenty of resources on my Instagram, just my name at Deonna Smith. And I actually have a freebie for the listeners today. So I will pass it along. Yeah, hopefully it'll be in the show notes. Will that work?
It sure will, yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, absolutely. I have a freebie that focuses on joy just for y'all as well. Because I know, you're probably like, okay, Deonna, like give me some hard and fast details. So I got you the freebie for this.
Perfect. So I'll make sure that's in the show notes. Make sure to grab it, everybody, because free, a good way to start. And then, of course, you have your book, Rooted in Joy, and in Amazon, right?
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, it's at Target. So it's available quite a few places. Some Barnes & Noble even have it in person. So if you're in person, you might be able to snag a copy as well. But yeah, that's a great place to start. And I really wrote it for you to go back to it over and over again because there's a lot of like details and different things. So the idea is you're kind of like thumbing through it multiple times throughout the year and going back to the chapter that, talks about what you need support with and moving forward from there. So definitely check that out as well.
So what's resonating with you at that moment in time or what you think you want to work on? I like it. So how is it organized? Is it organized kind of like by that framework we were talking about? Or is it more like a list of
Yeah, it's got some strategies, but it has a whole chapter though that's dedicated just to kind of thinking about the mindset shifts that you will do. And then there's another whole chapter that's just focused on that one component, which is I am joyful, the internal work that you're doing. And so there's a few pockets. And then there are two chapters that are dedicated to like lots and lots of strategies, really, tactical things that you can refer to when you're having challenges with students, like just go back to and reference. So I tried to make it as comprehensive as possible, but also very digestible because I didn't want it to be just like, super theory heavy book, but it does have some of that in there too. So.
Okay, great. So I will link all that in the show notes. Is there anything that you want to leave our listeners with today that we didn't touch upon, or you just want to like reinforce that point?
Would just say, that remember that, you can do it. You have the power to create these joyful and inclusive spaces where you and your students can thrive together. And I also do this work with schools. So if this sounds like something your school or your district could benefit from, send me an email, or you can learn more at deonnasmithconsulting.com. And just remember, that we're rooting for you. We have your back. We're here to support you. And I truly believe that, for the folks where teaching is really their calling, I think that embracing more joy will make it so much more sustainable for you.
Absolutely. And especially now, this is really what we need. So thank you as always for just your eloquent words and the way you break things down for us, because I just love having these conversations with you. So very thankful you came on the podcast again. It was so nice to reconnect.
Yeah, so nice to be here. And thank you all for listening again. And I'll see you somewhere, YouTube, Instagram, somewhere around there.
Yes, we'll point them in your direction.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you. If you've loved this show, then join me in sharing the teaching,
hitting that subscribe button,
and leaving us a review on
iTunes,
so we can be found by more teachers like you who are ready to start sharing the workload. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Find new episodes each week on sharedteaching.com. Thanks for listening to the Shared Teaching Podcast. And is there anything last that you want to leave our readers with? So we're talking about books.
Yeah,
And is there